welcome, close your eyes when you're ready and let the stillness settle over you. Far from the day, we'll wander softly into the Old Norse tale of Asgard's Great Wall. If this brings you rest, subscribe and there'll be a new one waiting tomorrow night. The long sections of stone lie across cold ground in the pale quiet after the war. They are not catastrophic in appearance, not smashed, not burning, not heaped in disorder. They are simply tilted, the way old things settle when the force that once arranged them is no longer present to hold them in place. Frost has gathered in the cracks between the blocks. The gaps between one fallen stretch and the next are wide enough that the wind moves through them freely, without slowing, carrying whatever the wind carries from the direction of the distances beyond Asgard's edge. The wall has been in this condition for some time, long enough that the frost looks like it belongs there, long enough that the ground where the stones once stood has begun to grow back over its own foundations, and the broken line of the outer boundary has taken on the quality of a landscape feature rather than a recent wound. This is Asgard after the Aesir-Vanir War, not after a catastrophe still in progress, but after one that has settled into its consequences and been left in them. The war itself, a conflict between two great divisions of the Norse divine, the Aesir who held Asgard, and the Vanir who dwelled in their own realm, ended not in the decisive victory of one side, but in a truce, and in the particular kind of stillness that follows a truce, not peace exactly, but the agreement to stop. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic scholar and mythographer who compiled the Prose Edda in the 13th century, and whose writings preserve the most detailed account of Norse mythology available to us today, records that Asgard's walls were damaged or destroyed by the end of that conflict. Left in the condition the stones now show, long pale sections lying across ground that no longer has anything to contain it. The outer boundary of the god's realm reduced to a suggestion of what it once was. What the Prose Edda preserves of the Aesir-Vanir War is relatively brief and fragmentary, a few passages rather than a full account. But the state in which the conflict left Asgard's walls is mentioned specifically enough to suggest it was understood as an important fact about the world, a condition to be noted because it would matter. The truce between the two divine groups was sealed in the particular way such agreements were sealed in Norse mythological tradition, through an exchange of hostages, prominent figures from each side sent to live among the other as a guarantee of the peace. From the Vanir came Njord, the god associated with the sea and coastal prosperity, and his children Freyr and Freyja. From the Aesir went Honir and Mimir. The exchange accomplished what exchanges accomplish. It bound the two sides to one another in a way that made renewed conflict costly and complicated. But it did not rebuild anything. The walls stayed as they were. The stones remained where they had fallen. The gaps remained open. And the realm whose name contained, inside its first syllable, the promise of an enclosure, a fortified space, a domain with defined edges, was left without the physical thing that name implied. The name itself holds something worth staying with for a moment. The Old Norse word element, from which the second part of Asgard derives, that element translated and carried into the name as something like an enclosed or walled space, a bounded domain, distinguished from the wilderness outside it, was not unique to Asgard alone. The same element appeared in Midgard, the name for the realm of human beings, and in the Old Norse word for a farm enclosure, and in the compound from which the modern English word garden is ultimately descended. When the Norse tradition named Asgard, it embedded an architectural aspiration into the naming, the idea that this was a place defined by its boundary, that the enclosure was not incidental to what Asgard was, but constitutive of it. A realm whose name means, in some essential way, the enclosed space of the Aesir, the garden of the gods, in the oldest sense of garden, not decorative plantings, but the space that has been separated from what lies outside it, given a wall, made into somewhere rather than simply part of everywhere. The wall, then, was not merely a defensive installation, it was part of what made Asgard, Asgard, part of what the name described. And so its absence, after the war, was not simply a practical vulnerability. It was a kind of incompleteness in the thing itself. The realm carrying a name that described an enclosure, it did not yet, in the condition in which the war had left it, actually have. The stones lay across the cold ground, and the gaps stood open, and the name hung over the realm like an aspiration rather than a description. Beyond those gaps, in the direction the wind came from, lay Jotunheim, the realm of the Jotnar, the beings most commonly translated into English as giants, though the translation compresses something more complex than physical size, occupied, in the Norse cosmological arrangement, the position of Asgard's primary and most persistent source of hostility. The Jotnar were not merely large. They were, in the oldest layers of the tradition, something closer to what the Greeks might have called primordial forces, or what a modern reader might recognize as the embodiment of entropy and the untamed, the forces that existed before the gods, and that the gods had not so much defeated as managed, contained, kept at a negotiated distance through a combination of force, cunning, and the physical reality of Asgard's walls. The cosmological arrangement in which the gods existed placed them in permanent relationship with the Jotnar, not simply as enemies in a war that might one day end, but as opposite poles in a structure that required both. The Jotnar pushed against the boundaries of order. The gods maintained those boundaries. The walls of Asgard were part of the mechanism by which that maintenance was accomplished. To understand Jotunheim is to understand it as a landscape of a particular kind, not simply a distant country on the map, but a place whose distance from Asgard was cosmological as much as geographical. The tradition did not think of the 9 realms in terms of directions and miles. They were arranged along the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, whose body was the axis around which the entire Norse cosmos was organized, its crown reaching into the highest realms, and its roots descending into the oldest and deepest ones. Its trunk, the connective tissue of a universe held together by the body of a tree. Along those branches, in the arrangement the tradition describes, the 9 inhabited realms each occupied their own particular position. Asgard among the highest, Jotunheim in its own location, in the arrangement, Midgard below and between, and beneath everything, the well and the roots, and the depths where the oldest things in the cosmos rested. Jotunheim, in this arrangement, was not simply west of Asgard or north of it. It was in a specific cosmological relationship with Asgard, proximate to it along the structure of the tree, close enough that the absence of a wall was not merely inconvenient, but structurally significant, a gap in the arrangement of things. The vast unmapped interior of Jotunheim itself was understood not as a blank space awaiting discovery, but as a wilderness in the old sense, not an absence of landscape, but the presence of a landscape organized by different principles than the one inside Asgard's walls. There were Jotnar and Jotunheim who had names and histories and relationships with the Aesir that were sometimes hostile and sometimes, oddly, familial. Several of the Aesir had Jotnar mothers or Jotnar wives. The boundary between the divine and the primordial, more permeable in practice than the cosmological arrangement might suggest. Odin himself, the All-Father, the god of wisdom and death, and wind, and the runes, was the son of a Jotun woman named Bestla. The enmity between Asgard and Jotunheim was genuine and persistent, but it was not a simple binary. It was the kind of enmity that exists between things that are not entirely separate, that have always been in relationship, that have always partly constituted one another, that cannot finally be resolved into two clean opposite categories. However, the mythology sometimes frames them that way. What the Jotnar represented, in the cosmological imagination of the Norse tradition, was the thing that the gods' order held in check. They were the cold beyond the fire. They were the immensity beyond the farm wall. They were what existed before the gods made the world out of the body of Ymir, the first being, whose flesh became the earth, and whose bones became the mountains, and whose skull became the dome of the sky, and what continued to exist after that making, out in the distances beyond the made world's edges. The tradition held their hostility toward Asgard as a constant rather than an exceptional condition, not a threat that had recently arisen and might recently pass, a fact of the cosmological arrangement as stable and reliable as the arrangement itself. And so the wall that had been damaged in the war, the wall that now lay in long pale sections across frost-edged ground, its gaps open to whatever came from the direction of Jotunheim, was not simply a maintenance problem. It was a structural inadequacy in the way the cosmos was currently organized. The boundary between the ordered realm of the Aesir and the primordial wilderness of the Jotnar was supposed to be physical and real and solid. It was supposed to be the material form that Asgard's name promised. In the condition the war had left it, it was neither. And the gods, in the aftermath of the truce and the exchange of hostages, and the particular stillness of a conflict suspended rather than resolved, were left inhabiting a realm whose name described something their walls could not yet deliver. In the Norse cosmological tradition, Asgard was not accessed from all directions equally. The realms were not simply arranged on a flat surface, like countries on a map, each sharing open borders with its neighbors. Yggdrasil's structure organized the connections between worlds in a more specific way, and among those connections, the most famous and elaborately described was Bifrost, the bridge that arched between Asgard and the lower realms, particularly Midgard, and that served as the primary controlled point of access into the god's domain from below. The bridge shimmered in the colors attributed to it in the tradition, red and blue and green together, the appearance that gave it the name most commonly translated as the trembling or burning way, the structure that looked, from certain distances and at certain times of day, like the visible arc of a rainbow fixed permanently between one world and the next. Bifrost was guarded, Heimdall called the White God in some kennings, associated with light and vigilance and the capacity to hear grass growing and wool growing and see for distances that the tradition measures not in miles, but in the day's ride between one end of the world and another, stood at the near end of the bridge with Gjallarhorn the horn, whose sounding would, when the time came for it, serve as the signal that the old order was ending. But that use of the horn lay far ahead of the story being held here. In the present of Asgard's broken walls, Heimdall stood at the foot of Bifrost in the early dark and watched the distance on the bridge's far side, the one direction from which approach was controlled and visible, and met with a guardian who did not sleep. The bridge was watched. The bridge was held. The bridge was, in its own way, sufficient to what it was, a narrow point of entry, a passage that could be defended by a single figure of sufficient vigilance and divine attention. What Bifrost was not, and could not be, was the entire perimeter. The bridge accounted for one direction, one mode of approach, one path between Asgard and the realms below, the broader circumference of Asgard, the outer edge of the realm, the border that ran in every other direction, the long line between the ordered space the gods inhabited and everything beyond it, was not Bifrost, was not watched by Heimdall, was represented, in the current condition of the realm, by those long sections of fallen stone lying across cold ground, their gaps open to a sky that pressed close from the direction of the unguarded distances beyond. Snorri Sturluson's account in the Prose Edda does not dwell extensively on the state of Asgard's walls before the arrival of the builder, whose story the tradition is building toward. The references to earlier defensive structures, to whatever form the walls had taken before the Aesir-Vanir War left them in ruins, are passing rather than detailed, mentions in context rather than full descriptions, the kind of background detail that a tradition includes because it knows the audience understands the context well enough to fill in what is not said. Neither the Prose Edda nor the Poetic Edda, the older collection of mythological and heroic poems that Snorri drew on and preserved alongside his prose commentary, gives a detailed picture of what Asgard's original walls looked like, who built them, or how long they had stood before the war brought them down. Scholars working with the surviving texts have inferred from linguistic evidence and the internal logic of the mythological accounts that whatever had previously stood was understood to have been either ruined or insufficient. The condition was real, the need was real, but its history before the war is largely inference. What the tradition does make clear is the shape of the problem as it stood. The name of the realm described an enclosure. The enclosure was not complete. The primary controlled access point, Bifrost, Heimdall at his post, the narrow bridge between worlds, was intact and guarded. But the broader perimeter of the realm, the long outer boundary that the name Asgard implied, remained what the war had made it, a suggestion, a ruin, a line of fallen stone with gaps in it, through which the wind moved freely from the direction of distances the gods could not watch from Bifrost's foot. The 9 worlds arranged along Yggdrasil's branches and roots were each, in the tradition's understanding, fully inhabited and fully themselves, not distant abstractions or theoretical positions in a cosmological diagram. Actual realms with their own populations and their own weathers and their own relationships with the other realms and with the great tree that held them all. Niflheim below, the realm of cold mist and the dead who came there unremarkably, those who died of illness or age rather than battle. Muspelheim, the realm of fire, its inhabitants presided over by Surt, whose name carried the sense of something scorched and blackened. Alfheim, where the light elves dwelled. Svartalfheim, or Nidavellir, the realm of the dwarves, the craftsmen of the cosmos, whose skill with materials, metals and stone, and the invisible substances the tradition sometimes describes them, working in darkness and silence, and the sound of a cat walking, was considered without equal among any beings the 9 worlds contained. Vanaheim, the Vanir's own realm, from which Njord and Freyja had come to Asgard as hostages of the truce. Helheim, the realm presided over by the figure called Hel, whose name and whose realm shared a word, the vast territory into which the unremarkable dead passed through the gate and did not return. All of these realms existed along the tree. All of them were in relationship with one another through the tree's structure, through Yggdrasil's roots and branches, and the 3 wells that lay beneath its roots, and the 4 stags that moved through its canopy, and the eagle perched in its heights, and the serpent Nidhogg gnawing at its root from below, and the squirrel Ratatoskra running between the eagle and the serpent carrying messages that kept their enmity alive. The tree was not merely a metaphor for the connection between worlds. It was the connection, the physical and cosmological substance, through which the 9 realms maintained their relationship with one another, through which the gods moved when they moved between worlds, through which the fate of each realm was entangled with the fate of the others. If Yggdrasil suffered, all 9 realms felt it. If one realm's order collapsed, the others registered the change. Asgard, at the top of this arrangement, or near it, was not simply the realm the gods happened to live in. It was the realm from which the order of the cosmos was maintained and extended, the place where the Aesir held their councils and made their decisions, and from which they moved out into the other realms when the work of maintaining the cosmic order required it. Its walls were not merely the outer edge of a city. They were the physical expression of the gods' capacity to hold the boundary between order and what lay beyond it. To have those walls in ruins was to have that capacity compromised. Not immediately destroyed, the gods still existed, still held their councils, still moved through the 9 worlds, and did what they did, but the realm's outer expression of what it was supposed to be, the material form of the name it carried, remained incomplete. Frost-edged stone lying tilted on cold ground, the gaps between sections too wide for a wall. The tradition does not describe the gods as panicking in response to this condition. That register, urgency, alarm, the immediate pressure of a threat about to land, is not the one the sources sustain in this part of the story. What they convey instead is something more like a settled awareness of a problem that required a solution, a problem that had been sitting in the way things were since the truce ended. The war, a deficiency in the arrangement of the realm that everyone who lived there could see, and that the name of the realm kept, quietly pointing toward. The Jotnar were out there. Bifrost was watched. The rest of the perimeter was open. The gods knew all of this. They had known it for some time. The wall lay where it lay. The frost gathered in the cracks. The wind moved through the gaps and carried whatever the wind carried in from the direction of the vast, unmapped wilderness beyond the boundary that the realm's name had always promised, but could not yet actually claim. There is something in this condition, the great realm of the gods, the home of Odin and Thor and Freyja, and the assembled Aesir, known by a name that means enclosed and fortified, and made distinct from the wilderness, sitting with its walls broken, and its gaps open, and its perimeter defended only at a single narrow point, that the tradition seems to have found genuinely interesting as a starting condition. Not shameful, not temporary, and easily fixed. The kind of problem that required something extraordinary to solve. The ordinary resources available to the gods, their own labor, the work of their hands, their divine capacities applied straightforwardly to a construction problem, had apparently not been sufficient, or had not yet been applied to it, or had produced something that the Aesir Vanir War had then undone. The Prose Edda does not linger on why the gods had not simply rebuilt the wall themselves. The text moves forward, but the fact of the broken wall is established clearly, set in place as the condition from which the story proceeds, the specific deficiency that will make the next thing that happens make sense. And what the next thing makes visible, in retrospect, is how unusual the solution would need to be. The wall of Asgard, the wall whose completion would finally fulfill what the realm's name had always meant, would not be built by the gods themselves, or by the dwarves whose craftwork set the standard for every material thing made in the 9 realms, or by any other being whose labor could be called upon through ordinary means and ordinary agreements. The solution the tradition holds belongs to a stranger kind of negotiation, with a stranger kind of builder, under conditions that would reveal something true and complicated about the gods themselves, about how a community of powerful and intelligent divine beings could find itself bound to a bargain it had not fully thought through, and about what it cost them to find a way out of it. But all of that belongs to what comes after the wall, lying in its pale sections across the cold ground. What is here, in this part of the story, is the condition itself, the frost-edged stone, the open gaps, the wind moving freely through the broken boundary, and the 9 worlds arranged in their slow order along Yggdrasil's branches and roots, each going about its particular existence, while Asgard's outer edge remained what the war had made it. Bifrost catches the available light and holds it even in the early dark. The bridge arches upward from its foot where Heimdall stands. Its colors, the red and the pale green and the blue of it, the shimmer that is not quite fire and not quite water, but carries something of both, visible against the sky that presses down from above. From where Heimdall stands, a god whose senses are oriented toward detection and distance, the view along the bridge is unobstructed and watched and entirely sufficient for the one direction it covers. The bridge is real and solid underfoot. The guard is present and does not sleep. This one controlled point of access into Asgard is everything it needs to be. In the other directions, the long arc of the perimeter that the bridge does not touch, the outer boundary of the realm that runs away from Bifrost's foot in both directions and extends across the cold ground and into the distances where the wind comes from, there is no equivalent figure standing watch. There is no equivalent bridge, no other controlled point of access that narrows the approach into something that can be held by a single guardian. There is instead the fallen stone, the tilted blocks, the gaps wide enough for the wind, and beyond the gaps the cosmological wilderness that Jotunheim represents, the primordial immensity that lies always at the edge of what the gods have made and hold. The wall was meant to be there. The name said so. The wall was not there. The name kept saying so. And the long cold ground around Asgard's outer edge continued to hold the broken promise of it. The pale stone frost edged and tilted, the gaps between sections catching the early dark and letting it in from every direction except the one the rainbow bridge already watched. A figure appeared at the threshold of Asgard on foot, carrying nothing visible, dressed in the plain garments of a craftsman who has traveled a long road and arrived without ceremony. He did not announce himself from a distance. He did not call out across the open ground where the pale broken stones of the outer wall lay tilted and frost-edged against the cold earth. He simply arrived at the place where the gate stood, and he waited, and after a time, the gods became aware that someone was there who wished to speak with them. The Prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, compiled in Iceland in the 13th century from older oral and written sources, preserves the account of this arrival in a section called Gylfaginning, the beguiling of Gylfi, which contains many of the central myths of the Norse tradition set down in prose. In Snorri's account, the builder who came to Asgard is never given a name. He is identified only by what he does. He is a craftsman, a builder of extraordinary skill, and he has come to offer his labor. The name he was born with, the identity he carried before he arrived at the god's threshold, is held back from the reader the same way it was held back from the gods, present somewhere behind the professional manner and the composed bearing, but not yet visible. There is something worth noting in that composure. He stood before beings whose power over the 9 realms was, in the Norse tradition, absolute in most things, and genuinely consequential in all things. The Aesir, the primary family of Norse gods, those who lived and ruled and quarreled in Asgard, were not easily impressed by travelers. Odin, the All-Father, had wandered the worlds in disguise on his own errands. Thor had gone east to fight giants with his hammer. Tyr had placed his hand inside the mouth of the wolf Fenrir as a pledge of good faith, and kept it there until the bond held and the hand was gone. These were gods who had made and lost and remade things of enormous consequence, and the figure standing at their gate knew this and stood there anyway with the particular stillness of someone who has already done his calculations and found the numbers acceptable. What the builder proposed was this: he would rebuild the walls of Asgard, not repair the sections that lay broken and frost-edged across the ground. He would rebuild them entirely, raise a wall of such height and thickness and completeness that no mountain giant, no force from Jotunheim, no agency from outside the realm's perimeter could breach it. The wall he described was the wall Asgard had always been named for, but had not yet fully been. The word that sat inside the realm's name, the Old Norse element, meaning an enclosed, protected, fortified space, would finally be made real in stone. In exchange for this work, the builder asked for three things. He asked for the goddess Freyja as his bride. He asked for the sun. He asked for the moon. The gods heard these terms in a silence that the prose Edda does not describe in detail, but that is easy enough to feel from the shape of what came after. Three demands, each one larger than the last. Freyja first, and Freyja was not simply a goddess whose presence could be bargained away without consequence. She was among the most significant figures in the entire Norse divine community, held in deep regard by both the Aesir, the gods of Asgard, and the Vanir, the separate family of gods, with whom the Aesir had fought a war and then made a complicated peace. She was associated with love, and with the magic called Scyther, a form of prophetic and transformative practice that the tradition treated as among the most powerful available to any being in the 9 realms. She was associated with fertility and with the dead. The Prose Edda records that she received half of those who fell in battle, the other half going to Odin's Hall of Valhalla. Her loss would not merely have diminished the Aesir, it would have diminished everything the Aesir were capable of being and doing. Then the sun, then the moon. These were not decorative requests. In the Norse cosmological understanding, the sun and moon were not simply lights in the sky, but specific things that moved along, specific paths for specific reasons. The sun driven across the sky by the figure Sol in her chariot, the moon driven by Mani, each of them pursued by a wolf, whose catching of them at the end of time would signal the final dissolution of the worlds. To surrender the sun and moon was not merely to darken Asgard, it was to remove the light from all 9 realms simultaneously, to reduce every inhabited place along the branches and roots of the great ash tree Yggdrasil, Midgard, Jotunheim, Alfheim, Niflheim, and all the others, to a permanent and undifferentiated dark. The builder's demands were not demands calibrated to one realm. They were calibrated to the whole of existence. The gods called a council. This is a detail in Snorri's account that is easy to move past too quickly, but it is worth pausing on because of what it reveals about how the Norse tradition understood the divine community at Asgard. The Aesir gods did not operate under the absolute and unilateral authority of a single figure. Odin was the All-Father, the oldest and in many ways the most powerful of the gods, a figure of immense and sometimes terrifying consequence in the mythological tradition. But when a question of this magnitude arrived, when something was proposed that would bind the whole of the divine community and potentially affect the whole of the cosmos, the gods sat in council and deliberated together. The decision would be theirs collectively, not his alone. That council would have been a remarkable thing to witness if the tradition had preserved more of its detail. The great hall of Asgard, wide enough and old enough to contain the assembled divine community. The question of Freyja and the sun and the moon passed from god to god like an object that no one could comfortably hold for long. What the builder proposed was not merely unreasonable, it was cosmologically absurd, the kind of demand that under ordinary circumstances would be declined without particular difficulty. Asgard could rebuild its walls in some other way, some slower and more ordinary way, without surrendering its most significant goddess and plunging all 9 realms into permanent darkness. There was no reason in principle to engage with the proposal at all, but the wall was genuinely ruined. The Aesir-Vanir War, the conflict that had preceded the truce and the exchange of hostages between the 2 families of gods, had left the outer fortifications of Asgard damaged or destroyed, and the Norse tradition did not treat Jotunheim, the realm of the Jotnar, as a distant and theoretical threat. The Jotnar were not merely large beings who occasionally caused problems. In the Norse cosmological understanding, they represented something closer to a fundamental principle, the forces of entropy and chaos that had existed before the ordered world was made and that pressed always against the boundaries the gods maintained. Asgard, without a completed wall, was Asgard permanently open to those forces. The Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, guarded by the watchful god Heimdall, at its near end, protected one approach. It did not protect all of them. The need was real. The proposal was impossible. Somewhere between those 2 facts, the council sat and turned the problem over. It was Loki who spoke the terms that would change the shape of the negotiation. Loki occupied a position in the Aesir community that defied simple categories, not entirely one of them by birth, since his origins in the Norse tradition placed him in a lineage that touched Jotunheim, but bound to them by companionship and obligation, and the kinds of complex loyalty that develop over long shared experience. He was the figure the gods called on when a problem required a different kind of thinking, and the problem of the builder's proposal required precisely that. What Loki proposed was a set of conditions so restrictive that by his calculation they would make fulfillment effectively impossible. The builder could have his payment. Loki was not arguing that the gods should decline the offer outright. He was arguing that the gods should accept it under terms that would prevent the payment from ever coming due. The conditions he outlined before the council were these: the builder must work entirely alone, without assistance from any other person, and he must complete the wall within a single winter. If the wall was finished before the first day of summer, the builder would receive everything he had asked for. If a single stone was still unplaced when summer arrived, he would receive nothing at all. 1 winter, working alone. These were the locks Loki placed on the door. The council deliberated, and the logic held together well enough that the gods found themselves inclined to accept it. A wall of the scale the builder was describing, of the height and thickness that would make Asgard genuinely impregnable, was not something that could be completed by a single person in the months between the first cold of autumn and the first warmth of spring. The labor involved in quarrying stone, hauling it across difficult ground, shaping it, and placing it with the precision required for a defensive fortification of that ambition, was not a winter's work for one person. It was a generation's work for many. The conditions looked from the council's perspective like a safe bet. The gods would get as much wall built as possible before the deadline arrived, and they would owe nothing at the end of it. The builder, for his part, considered the conditions carefully. He did not refuse them immediately. He asked for one modification, a single addition to the terms. He wished to have the use of his horse. This was a request so apparently modest, compared to the demands it was nested inside, that the gods might easily have passed over its significance. A craftsman asking to use his horse. A working animal, something to help haul materials, the ordinary practical assistance that anyone undertaking physical labor might reasonably ask for. The builder offered no elaboration. He simply asked and waited, and the gods conferred once more. The Prose Edda is clear that Loki advised the council to permit this. The argument Loki made, apparently, was that the horse would make little difference to the fundamental calculation, that the wall still could not be completed by one man and one horse within the limits of winter, no matter how capable either of them might be. The conditions still held. The locks were still in place. The agreement would still expire with the wall unfinished, and the gods owing nothing, and so the gods accepted. The terms were set. The builder would work alone with the use of his horse, and he would have from the first day of winter to the last. The wall would either be finished before summer came, in which case Freyja and the sun and the moon would belong to him, or it would not be finished, in which case he would leave Asgard with nothing, and the gods would keep whatever portion of the wall he had managed to build. Both sides found the terms workable. The agreement settled into place between them with the quiet finality of a thing decided. The first day of winter had not yet arrived. The ground was cold, but the season had not formally turned. There was a period, brief, perhaps only a day or two, between the striking of the bargain and the moment the work began, in which everything was agreed and nothing was yet in motion. The gods could look across the broken outer perimeter of their realm and see it as it would soon begin to change. The pale fallen stones lying tilted across the frozen ground, the gaps in the old wall open to the wind that came from the direction of Jotunheim, the wide sky pressing down on a boundary that was not yet a boundary, not yet the thing its name had promised. The builder stood somewhere in that interval, perhaps looking at what he had agreed to build, perhaps not. He gave no indication of doubt. He gave no indication of anything beyond the composed professional readiness of someone who has accepted a commission and is prepared to begin. Whatever he knew about the terms he had accepted, whatever calculation he had done before he arrived at Asgard's gate, before he dressed himself in the plain craftsman's garments and walked to the threshold and waited, he kept it perfectly to himself. It is one of the more quietly compelling things about the way Snorri Sturluson tells this story, that the builder, across the entire account of the council and the negotiation, never performs anxiety or triumph or anything that would signal to the reader what he actually knows. He is simply present at the negotiation, composed, professional, asking for one horse, accepting the terms, and then waiting for winter to begin. The disguise the Norse tradition places over his true identity is not just a matter of name and origin. It is a matter of affect, of the carefully maintained bearing of someone who has entered a very large room and decided to be unremarkable in it. There is also something in the nature of the gods' agreement itself that repays attention. The Norse tradition places enormous weight on the concept of oath and pledge. A sworn agreement between parties carried a moral and cosmological gravity that made its violation a serious matter, regardless of the circumstances that had changed since the swearing. The gods did not enter into this bargain carelessly, even by the account of the Prose Edda. They deliberated, they modified the terms, they consulted with Loki, whose thinking in matters of negotiation and complexity was precisely what he was valued for. And at the end of that process, they made an agreement they believed was fair and that they intended to honor. The question of what it means to honor an agreement under circumstances that were not anticipated when the agreement was made is one the Norse tradition found genuinely interesting, and this story is among its more extended meditations on that question. But that meditation belongs to the events that followed the striking of the bargain, not to the bargain itself. At the moment the agreement was made, all that existed was the agreement. The gods on one side of it, the builder on the other, the terms clear between them, and the whole of winter lying ahead like an unmapped country that both parties would have to pass through before anything was resolved. The sun was still moving along its path across the sky. The moon was still following its own. Freyja was still present in Asgard, carrying the full weight of her associations, love and magic, and the careful tending of things that the divine community depended on. All three of the things the builder had demanded were still exactly where they had always been, undisturbed by the fact that an agreement had been made that placed them in a new kind of contingency. They moved and shone and existed as they always had, and the only thing that had changed was that their continued existence in Asgard now depended, with a precision no one had previously attached to them, on the progress of a wall. Freyja herself is worth pausing on for a moment in the specific texture of what the prose Edda describes. The account in Gylfaginning records that she, along with Odin and Tyr, was deeply unhappy when the gods began to entertain the builder's proposal seriously. The word of a god's agreement could close around her like a contract before she had consented to its terms, and the tradition does not smooth over the discomfort of that. She was present in the hall. The debate was conducted in her presence concerning her fate, and the Norse tradition does not pretend that her unhappiness was absent or irrelevant. It records it as part of the texture of the event, the gods deliberating a question whose answer would affect one of their own in the most fundamental way, and the one most affected standing within earshot of the deliberation. This is one of the places where the Norse tradition, for all its distance from the present, reveals the kind of ethical attention that makes these stories worth sitting with carefully. The gods were not indifferent to what was being proposed. They found it genuinely troubling. The conditions Loki offered were not just strategic, they were also a way of making the agreement bearable, of being able to say to Freyja and to themselves that the payment would never actually come due, that the locks were in place, that the thing they were agreeing to was theoretical rather than real. Whether that distinction holds up under scrutiny is a question the tradition holds with considerable patience. For the moment, though, everything was theoretical. Winter had not yet arrived. The work had not begun. The builder was at Asgard's threshold, with his horse not yet present, the stone not yet moved, the wall still lying in its long, pale sections across the cold ground. The whole of what would happen, the labor, the progress, the growing unease, and whatever followed, was still ahead, still entirely in the future, contained in the agreement the gods had just made, and the winter they were all about to enter together. The gods return to whatever gods return to after a council has concluded. The great hall went on being what it was, the gathering place of a divine community that had, at various points in the Norse tradition, quarreled and feasted and drunk and told stories about one another with the particular intimacy of beings who have known each other across an enormous span of time. The question they had decided sat with them in the way that decided questions often do, resolved in principle, not yet tested by circumstance. The builders stood at the threshold and waited, and in the time between the agreement and the beginning of winter, Asgard looked very much like itself. Bifrost shimmered at its angle in the sky, the colors moving through it in the way they always moved, the bridge connecting Asgard to the other realms in a great arc of cold light that Heimdall watched from his post at its near end. The outer perimeter of the realm, where the broken wall lay in its sections, was still and open and unchanged. The wind from the direction of Jotunheim passed through the gaps in the old stone without meeting any resistance. The sky above those gaps was wide and pale and pressed close to the ground in the way it did in the seasons before winter fully settled. All of that would change. The wall would begin to rise. The stones would begin to move. The winter would deepen, and the days would shorten, and somewhere in the progress of those months, the terms of the agreement would be tested in ways that the gods, deliberating in their great hall, had not entirely calculated. But none of that had happened yet. The agreement was made, and winter was coming, and for this brief interval between the two, the realm was simply what it had always been, magnificent, wide, and genuinely open at its edges. The cold was beginning to sharpen. The first day of winter was not far off. The builder, whoever he truly was beneath the professional composure he had worn to Asgard's gate, had made his bargain with the gods of the 9 realms, and the work that would follow from it was about to begin. Somewhere in the fields at the edge of Asgard, in the time just before the season turned, a horse was waiting. The gods had accepted the terms they believed would hold, the wall that Asgard's name had always promised, the enclosed and fortified space that the word guard had embedded in the realm's identity before the first stone was ever laid, was about to be built, or attempted, or both. The sun moved across the sky in the particular way it moved in the last days before winter. The moon rose where it always rose. Freyja went on being what she had always been, and the agreement that had been made in the great hall sat between all of these things quietly, not yet tested, not yet resolved, just present and waiting, the way that all agreements wait, for the conditions they depend on to be met or not met, for the world to tell them what they are actually worth. The first day of winter would arrive, as first days of winter always do, without any particular announcement. The cold would deepen, the ground would harden further, and the builder who had stood at Asgard's threshold with the composed bearing of someone who had done his calculations would call his horse to him and begin. Svadilfari moved through the dark of the first winter night, carrying a stone that should not have moved at all. The block was pale and massive, roughly worked at its edges, its weight pressing long grooves into the frozen ground as the stallion leaned forward in his traces. The rope lines ran back along his flanks, taut and trembling with the effort, and where his hooves met the earth, they punched through the surface crust and found the harder ground beneath. There was no sound on the plain outside Asgard's broken walls except the creak of rope and the slow percussion of those hooves, and the stone moving where stones do not move, drawn forward in the dark by something that was working without hurry and without apparent limit. The Norse tradition names this horse Svadilfari. In the account left by Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Edda, the 13th century Icelandic compilation that preserves much of what the medieval world still remembered of the older Norse oral tradition, Svadilfari is described as belonging to the master builder, the craftsman of unknown origin who had arrived at Asgard and proposed a bargain the gods had carefully considered, and then, with certain conditions attached, agreed to accept. The builder would raise a wall around Asgard. He would complete the work within a single winter. He would work entirely alone, without the help of any other person, and in exchange, if the wall stood finished when the first day of summer arrived, the gods would give him the goddess Freyja, the sun, and the moon. The conditions the gods had attached to the agreement were designed to make completion impossible. A single winter, a single laborer, the wall of an entire realm. The mathematics seemed to settle the matter before the first stone was lifted. Svadilfari changed the mathematics. Snorri's account in the Galfaginning is specific on this point in a way that repays attention. He does not describe the horse as helpful or as a valuable assistant to the builder's work. What the Prose Edda says is that Svadilfari did more than twice the labor of the builder himself each day. Not somewhat more, not meaningfully more, twice the labor and then some further portion beyond that. The builder who had arrived at Asgard with his craftsman's bearing and his extraordinary proposal was, by this accounting, the secondary force in the construction. Svadilfari was the engine. The builder was what came after. To understand what this means, it helps to understand something about the place horses occupied in the Norse world, not merely in practice, as working animals used for travel and hauling in war, but in the older and deeper layer of the tradition's cosmology. In Norse belief, as in the broader Germanic religious tradition from which it grew, horses were not simply useful creatures. They occupied a position of genuine sacred significance. They appear in ritual contexts across the record, in the blot, the sacrificial practice through which communities maintain their relationships with the divine forces that govern the world. A horse given in sacrifice was not the same as a pig or an ox given in sacrifice. The horse stood at a different register of value and meaning. It was a being understood to carry spiritual weight, to exist at a boundary between the human world and something beyond it. This quality in the horse, its position between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the natural and the divine, is already present in the image of Svadilfari hauling stone across the frozen plain outside Asgard's broken walls. He is doing something that falls within the category of ordinary equine labor. He is moving heavy objects over ground, but the scale and the consistency and the seemingly inexhaustible nature of his effort place him outside the ordinary. He is a horse working beyond the range of horses. The sacred dimension is already present in what he does, before the myth has asked anything stranger of him. The wall rose in those early weeks of winter by courses that the gods had not expected. Each morning, when the pale winter light came back over Asgard, there was more stone in place than there had been the evening before. The courses went up with the kind of precision that comes not from patience, but from mastery, each block set against the one below it with the unhurried accuracy of someone who has done this kind of work before. In other places, across a span of time that the gods may have found difficult to calculate. The builder moved along the growing wall in the mornings, checking and finishing, and in the nights Svadilfari hauled stone from wherever stone could be found in the landscape beyond Asgard's perimeter, each trip in the dark bringing back what the following day would need. There is something worth attending to in the nightly rhythm of this work. The builder constructed by day, Svadilfari hauled by night. The winter nights in the Norse cosmological world were long, the season itself structured around a particular quality of darkness, the kind that presses close and lasts. Svadilfari worked through that darkness without record of fatigue, without pause for rest that the sources describe, his breath rising in visible clouds against the cold air, and the stone traces trailing behind him as he moved through a landscape that had closed down to shadow and frost, and the sound of his own hooves. Whatever the horse was, he was not limited by the dark. He moved through it as though it were simply the medium in which his portion of the work was done. The gods watched this from a distance that was at first comfortable, and then, as the weeks passed and the courses of stone continued to rise, somewhat less so. The Norse mythological tradition understands the Aesir as a community of gods who governed their affairs through collective deliberation. The council that had debated and modified the builder's original proposal is one instance of this, but it reflects a broader pattern across the texts in which decisions of consequence are made together rather than by any single divine authority, even Odin. What this means in practice, as the winter deepened and the wall continued to grow, was that the gods were watching the same thing together, the same rising courses of stone, the same tracks left in the frost by Svadilfari's passage, the same gap in the wall narrowing by measurable increments with each passing week. The Voluspa, the poem of the seeress in the Poetic Edda, contains what scholars interpret as a passing reference to Svadilfari, a compressed allusion that confirms the horse's role in the wall-building story was part of the tradition long before Snorri set it down in prose. The poem does not elaborate. It does not need to. The reference is the kind made to something an audience already knows, the horse's name dropped into the older verse, with the confidence that the name alone carries sufficient weight. That the Voluspa would include such a reference tells something about how settled the story of Svadilfari was in the oral tradition, how thoroughly the horse had become part of the shared cosmological furniture of the Norse world. By the midpoint of the winter, the wall was higher than the gods had calculated it would be at midpoint. Not dramatically higher, not so far ahead of expectation that the outcome could be read with certainty, but high enough to shift the quality of attention the gods were paying to the construction. What had been observation became something more like keeping watch. The builder's conditions, the restrictions that had seemed to make completion mathematically impossible, were holding in their formal sense. He was working alone, without the help of any other person, while Svadilfari made those restrictions beside the point. There is a particular quality to the problem the gods were facing in those middle weeks of winter, and it is worth sitting with it. The agreement they had made was precise and contractual, the way Norse mythological oaths tended to be. The gods had promised a specific payment, contingent on a specific condition. The builder was meeting the condition, the wall was going up, and the payment, Freyja, the sun, the moon, was a payment whose implications extended far beyond Asgard itself. Freyja was among the most valued figures in the divine community, associated with love and fertility, and the particular forms of magic that she alone among the gods practiced at the highest level. The sun and moon were not possessions the gods happened to own. They were the light by which the 9 worlds lived, all of them, every inhabited realm, arranged along the vast structure of Yggdrasil, the cosmic ash tree at whose roots and branches the worlds were positioned, and whose existence sustained them. To give away the sun and moon was to plunge every world, not only Asgard, into permanent darkness. It was to end the conditions under which anything lived. Yggdrasil itself, the great tree, the axis of the Norse cosmos, is worth pausing at for a moment, because the scale of what was at stake in the builder's payment rests on understanding how the Norse tradition conceived of the world structure. The 9 realms were not separate places floating independently in space. They were interconnected by the tree's vast, slow architecture, connected by its branches and roots, in a relationship that was both physical and cosmological. What affected one realm could affect the others. What was taken from the sky above Asgard was taken from the sky above everything. Svadilfari hauling stone through the winter dark was not working on a local construction project. He was working on a wall whose completion would determine whether all the realms continued to receive light. The midwinter darkness settled over Asgard in its full depth, and the construction did not stop. The wall had grown into a structure that could be assessed as a structure now, not merely as courses of stone accumulating at the base. It had height and thickness, and the quality of something built to last, built by someone who knew how walls were made at this scale, with this kind of stone, for this kind of purpose. The builder's mastery was evident in the work itself. Whatever his intentions, whatever he truly was beneath the professional bearing he had presented to the gods at the outset, the wall he was raising was genuinely extraordinary. It had the precision of something built by someone who had done this before, elsewhere, across a span of time larger than Asgard could easily account for. Svadilfari moved through the midwinter nights with the wall growing taller at his back each morning. The tracks he left in the frozen ground had become a permanent feature of the landscape beyond Asgard's perimeter, wide scars running out toward the places where stone could be quarried or gathered, worn deep by repetition into patterns that would have been legible from a sufficient distance as the signature of enormous and sustained labor. The rope traces he wore left their own marks at the edges of the path, and the blocks he moved left their marks too, smooth impressions in the frost where they had rested between hauls, long scrapes in the harder ground where they had dragged. The landscape around Asgard had been altered over the weeks of construction by the sheer volume of material that had passed through it. What the gods understood by the time the deep midwinter had passed and the light had begun, almost imperceptibly to return, was that the conditions they had set on the agreement, the single winter, the single laborer, were not going to be enough. The condition had been set to make completion impossible. Svadilfari was making it possible, and the condition, in its precise contractual form, said nothing about horses. The question of what the gods were thinking in those weeks, whether there was any collective discussion, whether the problem was being considered openly or privately, is not something the sources address directly. What Snorri records is the outcome, that with 3 days remaining before the first day of summer, the wall was so nearly complete that the gods faced the genuine prospect of fulfilling the payment. The wall was not finished, but it was close enough to finished that 3 more days of Svadilfari's hauling would close it. 3 days is a particular kind of remaining time. It is short enough to see the end from, and long enough that things can still happen. In the Norse mythological tradition, the structure of a fixed deadline, a day, a season, a specific named moment, carries weight throughout the corpus. Time in the Norse world is not simply the neutral container in which events occur. It has its own cosmological significance, its own relationship to the forces that govern things. The first day of summer was the moment against which the builder's contract had been measured. The wall that stood on the first day of summer, complete and standing, would complete the bargain. The wall that stood incomplete on that morning would release the gods from their obligation. And with 3 days left, the wall was nearly done. The gods gathered in the way they gathered to assess something that required collective attention, and what they assessed was this. Svadilfari was the problem, and without Svadilfari, the wall could not be finished in 3 days. The builder was a craftsman of extraordinary skill, but the mason who builds is not the force that brings the stone. Without stone arriving in sufficient quantity in the final 3 days, the final section of the wall would not close. The gods needed Svadilfari to stop working. They needed him to stop working in a way that fell within the formal terms of the agreement, which said nothing about horses and nothing about what might happen to a horse in the wilderness outside Asgard's walls. What the sources record is that the gods turned to Loki. The specific language Snorri uses in the Prose Edda is worth attending to, because the tradition is unambiguous about the direction of responsibility here. The Aesir did not simply ask Loki for his assistance, or suggest that he might want to intervene. They threatened him. They held him accountable for the situation, on the grounds that his advice, the original counterproposal, the single winter, and the condition of working alone, had been what drew them into the agreement in the first place. If the terms Loki had suggested had now produced a situation in which the gods were genuinely obligated to give Freyja and the sun and the moon to a Jotun craftsman, then the consequences of that situation were Loki's to resolve. The Aesir would deal severely with him if he failed. This detail, the gods' direct demand, the threat behind it, is part of how the tradition holds the moral complexity of what follows. Loki did not act alone from his own motives in the exercise of his own judgment. He acted under pressure at the gods' explicit direction, with a clear consequence threatened if he refused. The gods who would later find the action scandalous and cite it against him in the flighting poems of the poetic Edda were the same gods who had required it of him. The tradition records this without resolving it, which is characteristic of how Norse myth tends to handle the ethical complications it generates. The action happens, the responsibility is distributed, the story moves on. Loki left Asgard in the 3 days that remained. What the prose Edda describes next belongs to the disruption that Loki caused, rather than to its mechanism, because the transformation he undertook is recorded in the following part of the story. What can be said of those 3 days from the construction site's perspective is simpler. In the first night of the final 3, Svadilfari did not return from the wilderness with stone, the path that had been worn into the landscape over the full course of the winter, the deep scars running out toward the quarry grounds, the marks of the rope traces at the edges, the impressions left by blocks resting between halls, was quiet. No sound of hooves moving in the dark, no creak of rope under the weight of stone. The builder was on the construction site. The last section of the wall stood open, and his horse was gone. The image of the construction site in those final days has a particular quality that the prose Edda does not dwell on, but that the situation implies. The wall was almost done. The open section that remained was a specific gap, a measured distance of open sky above the level of the completed courses, a space that had been narrowing course by course over the whole of the winter. Everything else was built. The foundations were laid across the full perimeter. The courses had gone up evenly and with extraordinary precision. The mortar, or whatever the builder had used in the joints, had set and was solid. The structure was already, in the sections that were finished, the kind of wall it had been contracted to be, high and thick, and built with the mastery that had been evident from the first morning of work. Only the last gap remained, and without Svadilfari and the stone he could carry, the last gap would remain. The builder understood what had happened. The prose Edda records his reaction as a shift out of the human appearance he had maintained across the whole of the winter, a dropping of the craftsman's professional bearing, the careful disguise through which a Jotun had presented himself to the gods as a builder for hire. What was underneath was something larger and less composed. The tradition identifies him at this point as a Jotun, a member of the primordial forces the Norse cosmological system understood as the adversaries of divine order, not a simple enemy, not a straightforward villain, but something belonging to the category of beings whose relationship with the Aesir was constitutively tense, whose nature was associated with the chaos and entropy that existed at the edges of the ordered world the gods maintained. He had worked within the constraints he had agreed to. He had built with extraordinary skill. He had nearly completed the wall, and in the final days, the situation had turned against him in a way that the formal terms of the agreement had not anticipated, but that the practical reality of the construction had made possible for someone willing to work outside those terms. The horse was gone. The stone was not coming. The gap in the wall was going to remain. The gods sent for Thor, who had been away from Asgard in the eastern regions of the mythological world, fighting trolls in the manner that the tradition frequently places him in when the other gods are managing a difficult situation at home. The texts do not suggest this absence was coincidental. It is one of the Norse mythological corpuses, recurring structural patterns. Thor is elsewhere when the most complicated bargains are made, and summoned back when the resolution of those bargains requires a different kind of force. He returned travel-worn and informed quickly of the situation, and the Prose Edda records what followed with the brevity the tradition often uses for events that were settled rapidly. Mjolnir is Thor's hammer, the weapon that the Norse tradition describes as the primary tool of divine violence against Jotnar, capable of bringing down even the largest and most dangerous of the primordial beings. Its name is carried through the mythological record as a name that needs no explanation, a proper noun that has accumulated meaning through repetition across the full corpus of stories. Thor raised it against the builder died. The Prose Edda does not resolve the ethical weight of this cleanly, which is worth noting. The gods had sworn oaths at the outset of the agreement, protections that bound them to the terms of the contract in the way oath-bound agreements bound in the Norse tradition, which was seriously and with consequences. Killing the builder was not what a successful completion of the agreement looked like from the outside. The wall was not finished. The payment was not made. The builder, who had worked for a full winter under the conditions the gods had set, was dead. The Prose Edda records this and moves on. The tradition notes the irregularity and does not issue a verdict on it. The situation was what it was. The gods were keeping Freyja and the sun and the moon. The builder was dead. The wall was standing, nearly finished, in the way it would continue to stand. Outside Asgard's perimeter, in the wilderness where the winter still lay across the ground in its final days, Loki had disappeared into the forest and not yet returned. The construction site was still now. The path that Svadilfari had worn across the frozen landscape over the full course of the winter lay quiet in the late winter light. The deep grooves of the stone block's passage, the hoof marks, the rope scars at the margins, all of them exactly where they had been when the work was in progress, preserved in the ground the way the traces of enormous sustained effort tend to be preserved when the cold has been long enough and the labor heavy enough to cut past the surface into what lies beneath. The wall stood along its finished sections at its full height, pale stone in the thin winter sun, built with the precision that had been evident from the first morning, and sustained without deviation through the whole of the building season. The last gap was there, above the level of the last completed course, open to the sky the way it had been open since the summer before the building began. It was a smaller gap now than it had been then, much smaller, measured against the full perimeter of the wall that flanked it on both sides. The open space that had once been a ruin, extending in long pale stretches across the cold ground, had been reduced to this, a specific section of sky, framed by finished stone on either side, waiting. The first day of summer would arrive, as it always arrived, on the morning it had been appointed to arrive. The deadline would pass. The agreement would close without its payment made. Freyja would remain in Asgard. The sun would continue its path across the sky above all 9 realms. The moon would do the same. Whatever the builder had intended when he arrived at Asgard's threshold, with his craftsman's bearing and his extraordinary proposal, the outcome had not been what the proposal aimed at. In the forest beyond the construction site, somewhere in the wilderness that lay between the structured world of Asgard and the unmapped distances of Jotunheim, the winter was still doing what winters do in their final days, holding on against the light that was beginning to come back. Frost in the mornings over ground that would be softer by afternoon, the sky a particular shade in the hours before dawn that belonged to the season's end. Svadilfari had gone into that wilderness, following something that had led him away from the traces and the stone blocks and the long-worked path back to the construction site, into the dark of the trees and the cold of the ground underfoot. The sound of his passage had faded when it faded. The forest had taken it in the way forests take sounds, absorbing them into the general quiet of what lies under branches in winter, where the wind moves differently and the distance sounds travel is not the same as the distance they travel in the open. Whatever had drawn him in had drawn him deeply enough that the construction site fell out of earshot, and the wall and the builder and the long winter's labor that had brought the last section of that wall to within 3 days of completion. The wall stood in the last days of winter, the way finished things stand when they are nearly but not entirely complete, with the authority of the work that has been done visible in every course that had been laid, and the specific small incompleteness of the remaining gap holding its own particular quality in the late season light. It was a remarkable thing to look at, that wall, even in its near-finished state, perhaps especially in its near-finished state, when the scale of what had been built over a single winter could be assessed against the single remaining section that the winter had not quite reached. The stone was pale against the sky and pale against the ground. The courses were even and precisely fitted, the kind of work that carries in its visible surface the memory of the hand and judgment that placed each element. The wall the gods had needed, the wall that the name of the realm itself had been quietly insisting on, and the architectural promise embedded in the very word Asgard, the enclosed and fortified place, was mostly there. The gap above the final course was open to the cold and the light. Something was still in the forest, and it had not yet come back. At the forest's edge, in the last hours before a winter dawn, Loki completed what he had become. The hooves were the final detail, 4 of them settling into the frozen ground with a sound that was particular and real, the weight of the transformation finding its last few inches of shape in the cold. The breath came next, visible in the dark air, rising in slow clouds that were not a man's breath, and not quite an animal's either, but already, in that moment, something that Svadilfari would know without hesitation. The form was complete, the coat was present, and the color of it, and the warm animal smell that carries across open air before anything else does. Whatever Loki had been standing in that forest a short time before, he was not that anymore. What stood at the tree line now was a mare waiting in the dark, entirely convincing in the way that only something real can be convincing. The prose Edda in Snorri Sturluson's account of this episode is direct about what Loki was capable of. Shape-shifting appears across several episodes in that tradition, transformations into other animals, into other genders, into forms that crossed boundaries the rest of the gods observed as fixed. A salmon, on one occasion, female human form, on at least 2 occasions that carry mythological weight. The pattern across these episodes is consistent enough that transformation of this kind was understood as a genuine property of Loki's nature, not an isolated incident requiring special explanation. It was simply one of the things he could do. What made this particular transformation significant was not that it happened, but what it was for, and what it cost, and what it would eventually produce. The night Loki stepped out of that forest, the construction had been running for the full length of the Norse winter, from the first dark weeks of the cold season through the long midwinter period when the sky barely lightened and the stars were present for more hours than the sun. The builder and his stallion had worked without stopping. The wall had risen course by course, stone by stone, each block fitted against the next with a precision that had nothing human in it. The work of someone for whom this was not difficult, for whom the challenge had only ever been the calendar. The deadline was the weapon the gods had chosen, and in those final days, it was the gods who were watching it most carefully. 3 days of winter remained when the situation at the construction site had become what the Prose Edda describes, the wall so nearly finished that the gods could see clearly what was about to happen. The gap in the upper section was still there, still open to the sky, but it was closing. Each morning brought fewer stones remaining. Each evening, the opening was narrower than it had been at dawn. The deadline was a physical thing by that point, countable, visible, nearly arrived, and the gods had spent enough time watching the wall go up to know that 3 days and Svadilfari together were likely sufficient to close it. Freyja, the sun, and the moon. Those were the terms the builder had proposed, and the gods had accepted them under conditions they believed would make fulfillment impossible. The condition of working alone without assistance had been Loki's argument before the council, the single restriction he had persuaded the assembled Aesir to require. What none of them had anticipated in the deliberations of that early autumn council was the degree to which the stallion's labor would exceed any calculation they had made. The wall had gone up in a way that demonstrated, daily and without comment, that the condition had been understood too narrowly. The builder had not brought help in the form the gods had imagined and forbidden. He had brought help in the form of a horse. The Prose Edda is clear on one thing that the modern reader might be inclined to soften or set aside. The gods bore direct responsibility for what happened next. The assembled Aesir did not simply allow or encourage Loki's intervention. They demanded it, collectively and formally, and they threatened him with severe consequences if he did not act. This was not a case of Loki offering his services independently, or deciding on his own that something needed to be done. The gods went to him. The pressure came from above, from the weight of a community facing the loss of Freyja, and the permanent darkness that would follow the loss of the sun and moon, and that pressure was applied to Loki with all the authority the Aesir could collectively muster. He was the one who would cross the line. He was the one who would pay its particular price. But the decision to send him was theirs. What that price looked like in the immediate term was standing at the edge of a winter forest in the form of an animal waiting for a stallion who had been working without rest for months. Svadilfari was at the construction site when the mare appeared. The accounts do not give a precise distance, how far the forest lay from where the wall was rising, how much open ground lay between the tree line and the place where the final stones waited to be moved. What the account preserves is the outcome. Svadilfari saw the mare and broke free of his traces and went after her into the dark. The ropes fell slack. The stone block that had been attached to them settled where it was, heavy and still in the frozen ground, going nowhere. The builder turned and found himself alone at the construction site, without the horse that had been doing more than twice his own share of the work each day, with 3 days remaining, and stones that could not, without Svadilfari, be moved in time. The image of those traces falling is worth staying with for a moment. The traces were the practical fact of how the wall had been built, the mechanism by which Svadilfari's extraordinary strength had been harnessed and directed through the winter. They represented the whole system, and in the moment they went slack, everything that system had been producing, the daily progress, the courses of stone rising faster than any god had calculated, the sense of a deadline that had seemed generous becoming one that was arriving too soon. All of that stopped. The stone block sat in the middle of the path and did not move again that night. The builder could look at it and understand immediately what had happened and what it meant for the 3 remaining days and what it meant for the deadline. The mare and the stallion moved into the forest together, and the sound of their movement faded into the trees. There is a word in the Norse tradition that applies to what Loki had done, and the Prose Edda does not avoid it. The concept of ergi, a term denoting the shame associated with the passive or receptive role in a sexual encounter between men, and more broadly the stigma attached to any gender transgressive behavior in a man, applied to Loki's transformation and what followed from it with a directness that other gods would not hesitate to invoke. The flighting poem Lokasenna, preserved in the Poetic Edda, contains explicit taunts directed at Loki that reference his female reproductive role in what happened in that forest. The poem belongs to a tradition of formal poetic insult between gods, and the particular taunts addressed to Loki do not treat his transformation as a private or minor matter. They treat it as the kind of thing that remains attached to a figure's identity across time, available to be named again whenever the right occasion arises. Loki's gender-crossing transformations appear in enough episodes across the tradition that scholars have argued they represent something more structural than scandal. The capacity to move between genders, like the capacity to move between species, belongs to the set of properties that define what Loki is, a figure whose nature is not fixed in the way the other gods' natures are fixed. Odin maintains his authority. Thor maintains his strength. Freyja maintains her sovereignty over her particular domains. Loki maintains almost nothing, in the sense that the shape he holds in any given moment is not necessarily the shape he will hold in the next. This makes him useful in exactly the ways the gods needed him to be useful at the construction site. It also makes him the one who absorbs the cost of what that usefulness requires. The cost, in this case, included not just the transformation, but its consequence. The mare and the stallion were in that forest for what the accounts suggest was a season. The winter that had governed the entire construction project, the single winter the gods had required the builder to work within, was the same winter that contained Loki's time in the forest. When he eventually came back to Asgard, leading what he had returned with, the wall was already the shape it would remain. The builder was no longer present, and Loki arrived at the gate of Asgard, leading a foal. But that foal belongs to the next part of this story, and the forest is where the narration rests for now. The builder was alone at the construction site when the realization settled over him. The account in the Prose Edda describes his rage at that moment, and the description is specific enough that it confirms what his rage also confirmed, his true nature. The master builder, who had appeared at Asgard's threshold in the bearing of a professional craftsman, who had stood before the assembled gods and proposed his terms with the composed stillness of someone whose disguise was working, was a Jotun. The anger broke through what the disguise required. What the gods saw in that moment was not the craftsman who had been building their wall, but the primordial figure that had been behind the craftsman all along, standing now at the failed construction site with 3 days of winter remaining and the wall unfinished, and the horse gone into the forest with the mare. The tradition does not give the builder a personal name. In Snorri Sturluson's Gylfaginning, he is the builder, the craftsman, the one who arrived and proposed the bargain, identified entirely by his role and his disguise and the terms he had asked for. The absence of a name is interesting, not because it signals that the figure was unimportant, but because it signals something different, that his identity was always primarily a functional one. He arrived at Asgard to build a wall. He proposed terms for building it. When the wall went unfinished and the terms collapsed, the disguise collapsed with them, and what remained was not a named individual, but a Jotun, a member of the category the gods had always understood to be on the other side of whatever boundary Asgard was trying to maintain. Thor was not in Asgard when the Builder's rage revealed his identity. The Prose Edda notes that Thor had gone east, to the regions of the mythological world where trolls were a concern requiring his particular attention, and had been absent throughout the negotiations and the construction. He returned to Asgard and was informed of the situation in the practical way that someone who was not present for a development is always informed of it, quickly, by others who had been there. What the account conveys about his response is that it was direct. Thor was a figure whose relation to the Jotnar was among the most consistent and uncomplicated elements of his mythology. He carried Mjolnir precisely for the kind of work that a revealed Jotnar at the construction site represented. Mjolnir struck the builder, and the builder died. The Prose Edda records this plainly, and the plainness of the record is itself worth noting. The killing is not described as a battle. It is not a prolonged confrontation with an uncertain outcome. It is the application of the hammer to a problem that the hammer was made for, and then the problem was gone. Thor moved through the situation with the same directness he applied to most situations, and the account moves through it at roughly the same pace. What remains after the blow is the more interesting thing to sit with. The gods had sworn an oath at the outset of this agreement. The terms under which the builder had been invited to work at Asgard had carried the protection of divine oath, the kind of oath that, in the Norse mythological tradition, carried genuine weight and genuine consequence when broken. The protection was conditional on the builder fulfilling his contractual obligations, and the Prose Edda offers this as the relevant frame. The builder had not completed the wall in the time required, and the gods argued that the terms had therefore not been met, and therefore the protections of the oath no longer applied. This was their reasoning. The Prose Edda records it as the reasoning they offered. The Prose Edda also records, without dwelling on it at length, that a sworn oath had been broken. The tradition does not use the language of full moral exoneration. It notes the oath. It notes that Thor killed the builder. It notes the condition of the wall in the aftermath. These things are placed alongside one another without a concluding judgment that settles the question of what it means that a community of gods, having sworn an oath to a builder they admitted to their realm, ended the agreement the way they did. The record is not silent on what happened. It is simply not fully resolved about how to characterize it, and that lack of resolution is part of what makes the episode worth sitting with carefully. The gods had been placed in an impossible position, not by accident or by the unpredictable complications of ordinary life, but by a Jotun who had designed the terms of the agreement specifically to create that position. The bargain had been structured from the beginning as an attempt to extract Freyja and the celestial bodies from the Aesir through the mechanism of a contract. The builder's professional disguise had been a deliberate concealment of the kind of entity he actually was. The gods had been deceived. This is also part of the record. The tradition holds both things simultaneously. The gods had been deceived into a dangerous agreement, and the gods had responded to the danger in ways that involved breaking their own sworn oath. Neither of these cancels the other. Both remain. The wall stood in the aftermath of the builder's death. That much was clear. The long work of the winter had produced something real, most of a wall, enough of a wall that the gap remaining could be addressed by whatever labor the gods chose to apply to it afterward, without the cosmic urgency that had governed the previous months. The great stones had been moved and fitted and stacked with a precision that did not require the builder's presence to remain solid. What Svadilfari and the builder had built in the winter months stood there in the early spring air, pale stone in long courses, rising to the height that the original agreement had specified, finished except for the section that the last 3 days should have closed but hadn't. The gods stood near it in the period after the builder's death, and the account suggests something quiet in how the prose Edda describes this moment, not triumph, exactly, and not the easy relief of a problem solved. The sworn oath was there, somewhere in the space between the finished sections of the wall and the empty construction site, where the stone block still sat, where Svadilfari had left it when the traces fell. Thor's departure from the site, the absence of the builder, the wall, these were the facts of the situation, and the gods moved through them without a full resolution that the prose Edda was willing to declare. Loki was still in the forest. That was the other fact. The gods knew, by the time the builder was dead, and the wall stood mostly complete, and the spring air was beginning to arrive at Asgard's edges, that Loki had gone into the forest in mare form, and had not returned. They knew what that meant in terms of what the mythology holds about what had happened in that forest, and they knew that whatever Loki had gone in with, he would eventually come back out with. The tradition says he did come back. It says what he was leading when he arrived at Asgard's gate. But that arrival is its own moment, with its own weight, and the forest is still present in this part of the story. The builder's death had settled one question, the question of what happened to the agreement when the builder was revealed as a Jotun, and the wall went unfinished. It had opened something else, or rather left something open that had been open throughout the winter without being examined directly. The gods had sent Loki into a situation that required a kind of crossing none of the other Aesir had been asked to perform. They had done this with collective authority and formal threat. Loki had done what he was sent to do. The cost of what he had done was his to carry in the way that the Norse tradition records costs, not erased, not diminished by context, not removed by the fact that the gods had asked for it. Present, named, available to be named again, as the Lokasena would name it, whenever the record was recited and the taunts were in order. There is something in the structure of this episode that the tradition holds without resolving. A community had made an agreement. The agreement had been made in bad faith on the other side. The community had responded to the threat by sending one of its own across a boundary. That boundary crossing was known to cost, and the one sent had crossed it, and the threat had been neutralized, and the one sent had gone into a forest and was not yet back. The gods standing near the nearly completed wall in the early spring were not a community that had cleanly escaped a danger. They were a community that had survived one, with the marks of how they had survived it still visible, still attached to the story in ways the story would not drop. The construction site was empty and cold. The stone block that Svadilfari had been pulling sat where it had come to rest when the traces fell, exactly where it had been when the mare appeared at the forest's edge, and the stallion broke free and ran. The builder's tools, if he had tools, were gone. The builder himself was gone. What remained was the wall, standing in the quiet air of the season turning, and the gap at the top of the final section where the last few courses of stone had not been laid, open to the sky, and the long silence of the forest at the edge of the construction site, where 2 horses had gone into the dark and not come back yet. The gap in the wall was a small thing relative to what had been built. The winter's work was visible in its scale, the long pale courses rising across the perimeter of Asgard, the enormous blocks fitted without gaps along their faces, the whole structure carrying the marks of Svadilfari's labor in the size of the stones that had been moved and the speed at which they had gone up. The horse had done more than twice the builder's own work each day. What that looks like in stone is what was standing there in the early spring, a wall whose scale testified to the strength that had built it, enormous and precise, the work of something that was not merely a horse, even if it appeared to be one. The Norse mythological tradition was not inclined to treat horses as ordinary. Across the broader Germanic religious world from which the Norse sources drew, horses occupied a category of sacred significance that set them apart from other working animals, beings with spiritual power, included in ritual contexts, understood to be capable of crossing between the natural and the divine in ways that other animals were not. Svadilfari fit within this understanding while exceeding it. A horse who could move those stones at that pace was already extraordinary within a tradition that understood horse nature as already extraordinary. That Svadilfari was the horse he was, capable of the labor the Prose Edda specifically credits him with, made him a figure whose place in the story was not simply mechanical. He was the reason the wall had nearly been built. He was the reason Loki had to go into the forest. He was the one whose departure from the construction site had determined the outcome of the agreement in its final days. And he was in the forest when all of that was being examined by the gods standing near the wall. The Vulgspa in the Poetic Edda contains an allusion to this episode, a brief reference to Svadilfari that scholars read as confirmation that the horse's role in the wall-building story was well established in the oral tradition before Snorri set any of it down in prose. The reference is not a full recounting. It assumes that whoever is hearing it already knows the shape of the story well enough that a brief mention of the horse is sufficient to locate the listener inside it. This is what the illusion technique in the Poetic Edda does. It points at things rather than narrating them, relying on the shared knowledge of the tradition to complete what the gesture indicates. The fact that Svadilfari is gesturable in this way, available to be pointed at in passing rather than explained, suggests how deeply the episode was embedded in the oral culture that carried these stories from one generation to the next. The Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda together, Snorri's compilation, and the older verses it draws from and preserves, give this episode the quality of something that had been told many times before. Either of them fixed it on a page. The variations that survive between sources are not large enough to suggest fundamental disagreement about what happened. They are the variations of a story that has been told in many rooms, by many voices, over a long period, arriving at the written record with the smoothness of something that had already found its shape. The builder arrived, the bargain was struck, the wall went up faster than the gods expected. Loki was sent into the forest. The builder was killed. Loki came back from the forest with something. These are the fixed points, and they hold across the sources, and the tradition built its understanding of them around those fixed coordinates. What the tradition does not do in any of those sources is tell this story with the cleanness of a tale about right and wrong that arrives at a verdict. The builder was a deceiver who had concealed his nature to gain access to the gods' realm and proposed terms designed to strip them of Freyja and the sun and moon. The gods were oath-bound protectors of a community who had made a desperate agreement under pressure and broken it under different pressure. Loki was a figure who had been formally threatened into a transformation and a consequence that the tradition records as scandalous and does not record as cancelled by the compulsion behind it. The wall was built, mostly, by a Jotun and his horse, and it stood in the early spring air, and the gods who stood near it were the gods who would continue to inhabit Asgard behind it. This is the shape of the episode in the tradition. Complicated, recorded honestly, not smoothed into a simpler story than it was. The prose Edda does not present the gods as heroic at every moment. It presents them as a community that faced a genuine threat, made a desperate arrangement, and found their way out of it through means that the tradition acknowledges were costly and morally irregular. This is part of what makes the Norse mythological corpus interesting to sit with, its willingness to record the divine community behaving in ways that are neither straightforwardly admirable nor simply condemnable, and to leave the record there, available to anyone who reads it, without insisting on a conclusion that the events themselves did not produce. The wall stood. The builder was gone. The god who had been sent into the forest was in the forest. The construction site was quieter than it had been at any point in the winter, quieter than the early weeks when the work had begun, and the scale of Svadilfari's labor was still being revealed, quieter than the midwinter nights when the horse's breath had been visible in clouds against the dark sky as he pulled the enormous stones across frozen ground, quieter than the final days when the gap in the wall had been narrowing course by course, and the gods had been watching it narrow with the particular attention of people whose deadline was becoming a physical weight they could feel. All of that was over. The gap that remained in the final section was still there, open to the sky, the place where the last few stones had not been laid, because the horse had run into the forest on the second to last night before the deadline, and the builder had found himself alone with stones he could not move in time. The cold air of the early Norse spring moved through that gap. The stone block sat where it had stopped moving. The traces lay where they had fallen. Somewhere in the forest beyond the construction site, further in than the sound of the construction carried, a mare and a stallion had gone in the direction the dark made available, and the sound of their movement had been the last thing that part of the story produced before the silence took over. The forest was still there at the edge of the site, its interior as dark as it had been on the night the mare stepped out of it, from the construction site, or from the nearly completed wall. Looking in that direction, there was nothing to see. The trees, the early light not reaching far between them, the frozen ground giving way to the deeper shadow beyond the first few trunks. Nothing moved that was visible. Nothing came out of the forest at the edge of the construction site on any of the mornings of the early spring, at least not yet. The gap in the wall remained open, quiet, the sky visible through it in that particular pale quality of Norse early spring light, wide and gray and cold and genuine, the kind of light that has no warmth in it yet, but carries the information that warmth is somewhere behind it, coming slowly, and that the days are beginning to lengthen in the small, almost imperceptible way they do at first, before the change becomes obvious. Through the gap, the sky. Through the gap, the distance. Through the gap, the world beyond Asgard that the wall was being built to stand between the gods and the enormous, unmapped, cosmologically present wilderness of the other realms, the distances that were less geographical than structural, the Jotunheim that lay somewhere out past the boundary that the wall, when it was finished, would formally declare. Loki was in the forest, and the forest held its quiet, and whatever the forest was keeping was not yet ready to be given back. Loki came back from the forest, leading a foal. The young horse walked beside him across the threshold of Asgard, on 8 legs, each pair moving in its own unhurried rhythm, the hooves finding the cold ground one after another, with a sound that was soft and even, and slightly more than expected. 4 beats where 4 beats were anticipated, and then 4 more, each set distinct and calm and entirely sure of itself. The foal's coat caught what pale winter light remained above the wall's long shadow. His breath was visible in the cold air, rising in small clouds that dissolved before they reached any height. He He was not large yet. He was not remarkable in any way that announced itself immediately, except for the legs, and even those he carried without apparent awareness of what they were. 8 legs stepping through the world the way any young horse steps, tentative at the edges of each new surface, confident in the movement itself. Loki said nothing, according to the tradition. The Prose Edda does not record what words, if any, passed between him and the gods assembled at the gate. What it records is the foal, the fact of him, the 8 legs, the parentage, and then the name that came with him out of the wilderness, Sleipnir. The gods of Asgard had seen a great many things. The world they inhabited was not a world that kept its strangeness at a distance, and the threshold of Asgard had been crossed, over the long ages the tradition describes, by beings of every kind, gods returning from distant regions, emissaries from other realms, the occasional figure whose nature was not entirely clear at first glance. Even so, what Loki had brought back from the forest was something new. Snorri Sturluson, working from the older oral traditions in the early 13th century, records the matter plainly in the Prose Edda. The foal was Loki's offspring, born of his union with the master builder's stallion, Svadilfari, during the weeks Loki had spent in the wilderness, in the form of a mare. The Prose Edda does not pause on this at length. It states it the way it states most things, with the calm, matter-of-fact completeness of a tradition that had been holding this story for a long time before Snorri wrote it down, and that did not find it necessary to perform surprise at its own contents. What the foal became was this, the finest horse in the 9 realms, as the Prose Edda describes him, the best of all horses among gods and men. 8 legs where other horses had 4. The front pair moved as a horse's front legs move, reaching forward, pulling the body through space, bearing the weight of the head and neck and the long reach of the stride. Behind them, a second pair of forelegs, or legs that occupied the position forelegs would occupy on a longer body, and then the rear legs, and behind those another set, so that when Sleipnir moved at a full walk, the sound of him was a long, complex sequence, not quite a standard rhythm, not quite anything that could be predicted from watching the first few steps, a pattern that resolved itself, eventually, into something smooth and fast and covering ground at a rate that simply did not correspond to what the legs and the body suggested was possible. 8 legs in their separate rhythms, arriving finally at a single forward motion that moved through the world differently than other motion moved. The name Sleipnir has been interpreted by scholars of Old Norse as related to a root word meaning something like slippery or sliding, a quality not of instability but of movement that does not catch, that passes through resistance the way water passes through a hand, finding the path that is already open rather than forcing one. Whether the name came first or grew from what the horse turned out to be, the tradition does not say. Names in the Norse mythological world tended to carry weight, to describe or predict or confirm something about the thing they named. And Sleipnir's name fits a horse who could move between realms without apparent effort, whose 8 hooves found footing on roads that other horses could not locate at all. Odin received the foal. This is what the tradition holds, that Sleipnir was presented to the Allfather and became his personal mount, the horse that Odin rode across the 9 realms on whatever business the 9 realms required of him, which was considerable. Odin's existence, as the Norse tradition described it, was not a settled existence. He was a god of wandering as much as a god of anything else, a figure associated with wind and knowledge, and the particular kind of sight that comes from having given something irreplaceable in exchange for it. He traveled. He crossed distances that were not purely geographical, distances between states, between the living and the dead, between what was known and what was available only to those willing to pay a very specific price for it. A horse capable of traveling between worlds was not a convenience for such a god. It was something close to a necessity. The Prose Edda describes a world organized along the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, whose structure held the 9 realms in their separate positions: Asgard at or near the crown, Midgard in the middle regions, Jotunheim across a wide and largely impassable boundary, held deep in the roots beneath everything. The distances between these places were not distances in the ordinary sense. They were differences of kind, separations, not only spatial, but cosmological, each realm operating by its own internal rules and weather and population, connected to the others by the tree's vast, slow architecture and by roads and passages that required a particular kind of knowledge to find and a particular kind of capacity to cross. Sleipnir moved between them, where other horses stopped at a boundary and found nothing further. Sleipnir continued, his 8 hooves finding the path that extended past where other paths ended, moving through the space between one realm and the next as though the boundary were a surface rather than a wall. The clearest account of this capacity in the surviving sources is not about Odin at all. It concerns Hermodr, a figure the Prose Edda identifies as a son of Odin, and the journey he made to Hel following the death of Balder, the beloved god whose loss sent a particular kind of grief through Asgard. After Balder died, and after the news of it had settled over the gods with the specific weight of a thing that cannot be undone, it was decided that someone should ride to Hel and speak with the goddess who ruled there, to ask whether Balder might be returned to the living. Hermodr undertook this. Odin lent him Sleipnir for the journey, and the Prose Edda describes what followed in the measured language the tradition used for things that were genuinely extraordinary. Hermodr rode for 9 nights through valleys so deep and dark that he could see nothing around him, following a road that grew quieter and more removed from anything recognizable as the world, until he reached the river Gjöll and the bridge across it, which rang beneath Sleipnir's hooves, 8 hooves, and so a sound the bridge's keeper, Mothguth, noted as unusual, since the sound of 8 hooves resembled the sound of a full army rather than a single rider, and she had not heard that sound from any horse crossing alone. On the far side of the bridge lay the gates of Hel's realm. The Prose Edda describes Sleipnir leaping them, simply leaping, without apparent effort, clearing the barrier that marked the final boundary between the passage to the dead and the realm of the dead itself, landing on the other side with Hermodr still in the saddle, and continuing. No other horse in the mythological corpus is described as having done this. The gates of Hel were not a feature the tradition treated as easily overcome, and the ease with which Sleipnir crossed them was itself a statement about what kind of being he was. A horse for whom the boundaries that other creatures treated as final were simply another kind of surface, another thing to find footing on, 8 hooves landing surely on the far side of the most closed door the Norse world described. What Hermodr found inside that realm and how the journey resolved belongs to the myth of Balder's death rather than to Sleipnir's story. What belongs to Sleipnir is the road, the 9 nights and the dark valleys, the sound of the bridge ringing with more footfall than a single rider should produce, the leap above the gates, and then the return journey, back through all of it, the road from Hel to Asgard, traveled in the reverse direction, Sleipnir's 8 hooves finding the way back through the dark, with the same unhurried confidence with which they had found the way in. Scholars who have written about the symbolism of Sleipnir's 8 legs have noted a particular recurring interpretation, that 8 legs, in the context of the Norse funerary tradition, calls to mind the structure of a funeral bier, carried by 4 pallbearers, each contributing 2 arms, so that the object being carried moves on 8 supports rather than 4. The bier was the vehicle by which the dead were carried from one world to the next, from the living community to wherever the dead were understood to go, and the parallel with a horse who could carry a rider through exactly that same passage has struck multiple scholars as unlikely to be accidental. A horse with the structure of a funeral bier beneath him, 8 legs moving in the rhythm that a carried body moves, carrying his rider down the road to hell and back again, leaping the gates at the far end, returning through 9 nights of dark valleys. The interpretation cannot be proven in the way that a documented fact can be proven, but it sits in the tradition with a kind of completeness that feels less like a coincidence than like a meaning. The story was carrying all along, patient in the way that old meanings tend to be patient, waiting for the reader who would notice it. The Poetic Edda, the older collection of Norse mythological verse that Snorri Sturluson drew on alongside other sources, preserves a reference to Svadilfari in the Voluspa, the great cosmological poem spoken by a vulva, a seeress who surveys the Norse universe from its beginning to its end. The reference is brief, but its presence confirms that the tradition around the wall building and the horse born from it was not an invention of Snorri's prose compilation. It was part of the oral tradition before the prose Edda was assembled, moving through the culture in verse form, carried by poets who knew the story the way they knew the cosmological framework, as part of the architecture of the world, as their tradition had described it. The foal with 8 legs was always there, in the older tradition, even before the version that Snorri preserved. A flighting poem in the Poetic Edda called the Lokasenna, a poem composed as a formal exchange of insults at a divine feast, includes among its taunts directed at Loki a reference to his role in Sleipnir's conception. In the Norse tradition, flighting was a recognized literary and social form, a contest of verbal aggression governed by specific conventions, and the taunts within it carried real social weight. They were not empty words, but claims about the target's status, their violations of social norms, their particular vulnerabilities. The reference to Loki's female reproductive role in bringing Sleipnir into the world is used as an insult in the Lokasenna, drawing on the Norse concept of ergi, a term for the shame associated with gender transgressive behavior, particularly for a man occupying a receptive or feminized role. That the taunt appears in the poem confirms that the myth was part of the tradition, widely enough to function as cultural shorthand, that anyone present at the kind of feast the Lokasenna depicts would have understood immediately what was being referenced: the 8-legged horse and the shape his mother had taken in the forest, and what the tradition held it said about the god who had been willing to do what the other gods had asked of him. The Lokasenna is not a gentle poem. It records a feast that ends badly, and the taunts exchanged within it expose a great many things about the gods that they might have preferred to leave unexamined. But it also preserves, in its cataloging of these grievances, a record of what the tradition knew and remembered, including the 8-legged foal, who had come out of the forest in the depths of winter and been given to Odin, and the circumstances of his birth, and the name that he carried, and what he had turned out to be. What Sleipnir turned out to be was this: a horse grazing in the fields of Asgard in the long Norse summers, his 8 legs moving slowly through the grass as he stepped forward to reach the next patch, entirely unhurried, the completed wall of Asgard standing solid behind him in the warm air. He was also the horse that stood in Odin's stable on ordinary days, folded neatly in the stall, 8 legs arranged with the practical patience of a working animal between journeys. He was the horse on the road to hell, in the 9 nights of dark valleys, finding the path with his 8 hooves in the blackness with no apparent uncertainty. He was the horse leaping the gates at the far boundary of the dead's realm, landing surely on the other side in a single motion, and he was the horse that made the bridge ring when he crossed it. 8 hooves producing a sound that the bridge's keeper had only ever associated with armies before that day. In the Norse tradition, as the sources record it, the 9 realms were all inhabited simultaneously. The gods were living their particular lives. The dead were in their particular country. The frost giants in Jotunheim were exactly as they had always been, vast, cold, present at the edges of the divine world. The relationship between them and the Aesir never entirely resolved and never entirely ruptured. Midgard, the realm of human being, was going about its business beneath a sky that was the shared ceiling of the world, the sun moving across it and the moon moving after the sun, both of them running their paths because the events that might have removed them had not come to pass, the bargain that had threatened to darken all 9 realms having been resolved in the way it had been resolved. The wall standing, the sun still in the sky. Yggdrasil held all of this. The great ash tree's branches reached up through Asgard, and its roots went down through the deepest levels of the cosmological structure, past the well of Urd, where the 3 Norns, the weavers of fate, sat beside the water, past the well of Mimir, where Odin had paid the price of an eye for a single drink of what it contained, past Niflheim and the source of the rivers that had existed before most other things. The tree was not just a structure, it was a living thing in the tradition's account, and it required tending. The Norns watered its roots with the water from Urd's well, and covered its bark with the white clay of the sacred spring, and still, the tradition says, it was always in the process of being damaged, gnawed at its roots by the serpent Nithhogr, worn at its branches by the animals that fed there. Yggdrasil persisted. It was very old. The tradition describes a universe in which most important things were very old and persisted despite the various forces working against their persistence. And the great ash tree was perhaps the clearest image of that quality, something that held the shape of the world together, not because nothing damaged it, but because it continued anyway, enormous and slow, and still present. Sleipnir moved through the structure of Yggdrasil's world with the ease that the tradition described as his particular nature. Other beings were bound to the realm they occupied, or required specific dispensations to cross between them. The dead could not return from hell without conditions being met that were almost never met. The gods could reach certain places and not others without specific preparations. The Jotnar and the Aesir occupied their separate realms across a boundary that was constantly maintained and constantly strained. Sleipnir simply crossed 8 hooves on whatever surface the road presented, 8 legs in their complex rhythm resolving into forward motion, the boundary between one realm and the next, experienced by him as another kind of terrain, rather than a final limit. There is a quality the tradition gives to this, not making it dramatic, not framing Sleipnir's world-crossing ability as a power he wields or a thing he consciously performs. The Prose Edda describes him moving between realms, the way it describes other things moving through ordinary space. He goes, "The road is dark, or wide, or cold," and he continues, and arrives. The extraordinary is simply what Sleipnir does, the way a fish simply moves through water, not a feat requiring preparation and effort, but a natural expression of what he is. The 8 legs that made the bridge ring, the leap above the gates of hell, the 9 nights in the dark valleys with Hermo on his back, following the road that other horses could not find. Snorri Sturluson set all of this down in the early 13th century, working in Iceland, drawing on oral traditions and earlier written sources. and the particular depth of familiarity with the Norse mythological world that his culture still possessed, though the world was changing around it, and the older traditions were beginning to require exactly the kind of careful preservation that the Prose Edda represented. The story of the wall, the builder who arrived at Asgard, the bargain that was struck, the horse that proved more capable than any calculation had accounted for, the intervention that disrupted everything and cost something real, was old before Snorri wrote it. The Völuspá's reference to Svadilfari places it in the oral tradition far enough back that its full history is simply beyond what the surviving record can confirm. It had been told and retold, shaped by different poets in different contexts, passed through a culture that used it as both entertainment and as part of the larger story. It told itself about the world it inhabited and the gods who had made it and continued to inhabit it alongside the living. The wall that the master builder raised around Asgard was, by almost any accounting, a remarkable structure. Its stones were large, its courses were precise. It had risen through a single winter with an inhuman speed that even the gods had not anticipated, and by the time the winter ended, and the agreement with it, the wall was essentially complete. The last small gap closed in the aftermath of events, or perhaps left slightly open in the way the tradition sometimes left things slightly open, finished enough to stand, finished enough to serve its purpose. The name Asgard carried within it the word element guard, an enclosed or fortified space, a boundary maintained against what lay beyond it, had been, over that one winter, finally made real in stone. The promise embedded in the realm's own name had been kept, or nearly kept, at a cost that the tradition recorded without fully dismissing. The sun continued crossing the sky above it all. The moon continued after the sun. Bifrost shimmered at the controlled approach to Asgard, Heimdall at his post where the bridge met the realm's edge, watching the distance with the particular attention of a guardian who does not sleep. The 9 realms went on being what they were, each inhabited, each pursuing its own weather and population and internal logic, each connected to the others by the vast, slow structure of the tree, and by the roads between them, and by the occasional traveler capable of finding those roads and following them all the way through. And Sleipnir grazed in the fields beyond the wall, 8 legs moving through the long summer grass, each hoof finding the ground at its own pace, the complex rhythm of 8 resolving again and again into the simple fact of a horse moving forward, unhurried, in no particular direction, drawn only toward the next stretch of green that catches his attention, and the one after that. The wall behind him stood pale in the summer evening light, its stones solid and close-fitted, its shadow long across the grass in the late hour. The sky above it held the specific quality of a Norse summer sky in the long light, wide and pale and very high, the sun not yet fully set, but descending at the slow angle that kept the north luminous long after it had grown dark elsewhere. The foal who had walked out of the forest on 8 legs, unhurried and breathing clouds of winter air, had become the best horse in the 9 realms. The tradition held that this was simply true, not a boast, not an exaggeration, but a classification that the myth offered plainly and expected to stand without argument. Best of all, horses among gods and men, 8 legs carrying him wherever the road went, and past wherever the road ended, and down into the dark valleys below the world where roads went that no other horse could follow, and back again, 8 hooves finding the way home through 9 nights of lightless distance, returning to the stable in Asgard where Odin kept him, to the fields outside the wall where he grazed in the long-lit evenings of summer. The story the tradition tells does not end here. Precisely, traditions do not end in that way. the figures within them continuing their separate existences past the point where any particular story about them closes. Odin was still the All-Father, still wandering the 9 realms on whatever roads they presented, still carrying the particular weight of everything he had given up and everything he had taken on. The gods of Asgard were still assembled in their hall, the council that had gathered to deliberate over a craftsman's extraordinary offer having returned to the business of governing a divine realm with all the complications that task entailed. The Jotnar of Jotunheim were still beyond the wall, enormous and cold and present, the relationship between their realm and Asgard unchanged in its fundamental character by a wall of stone, however well constructed. Yggdrasil was still standing, still being tended, still being damaged, still enormous above and below. Sleipnir stepped forward through the grass, 8 legs in their pattern, and the grass moved around each hoof in turn as he went. The tradition that held all of this, the gods, the 9 realms, the wall and its complicated history, the foal who had come out of the winter forest and become the finest horse the world described, had itself moved through a long journey before it arrived in the form the surviving sources preserve. From the poets who first shaped these stories into the verse forms of the poetic Edda, through the centuries of oral transmission in which each telling carried the story forward and occasionally reshaped it, to Snorri Sturluson, sitting in Iceland in the early 13th century, writing down what he knew and what he feared was becoming difficult to know, and on from there through all the manuscript traditions and scholarly recoveries and the long, slow work of keeping old texts legible. The story had traveled a considerable distance, and the horse at the center of this particular part of it had traveled further still. 8 legs, the tradition said, best of all horses, capable of roads that no other horse could find, born from events that the tradition recorded with the same calm precision it brought to everything else, without embarrassment, without particular emphasis, simply as the way things had happened and the reason the horse was what he was. The wall of Asgard stood solid in the summer light,